Welcome to the Catalyst Sale Podcast with Mike and Mike. Sales is a thinking process. This podcast will help you learn about what works in sales, how to hone your skills, and increase your success. I'm your host, Jody Mayberry, and I am here with Mike Simmons today. Mike, you just returned from Tennessee and had a little bit of a road trip while you were there. How did it go?
The road trip was amazing. And in the course of a couple of days, we were able to not only knock off Georgia on the list of states, but Tennessee, North Carolina, and South Carolina. So one of the advantages of driving around in the Southeast.
Mike, I have only one state out of 50 I have not been to. Only Alaska. That's all that's missing. So I appreciate a good road trip.
I was wondering if you were going to say Alaska or Hawaii, and then thought those were too easy. It was going to be a Dakota or something like that.
Yeah. Well, speaking of road trips and sales, I did such a good job at selling you on how delicious a piece of pie was from a certain place. You actually went out of your way to go there and had a bit of a disappointment. So I'm pleased with my sales ability that made you want to go there, and disappointed for you that they happen to be closed.
Well, and I know we've talked about this before on previous podcasts, the importance of having a plan. So we did have a plan. We then put the location into a Google Maps and found out that it was not open on Sunday. So we adapted the plan, we iterated, and went straight to Asheville instead of stopping in Waynesville on the way. And I was going to say we turned lemons into lemonade, or pecans into something a little bit better, but ultimately turned into a great trip. And when we had a chance to drive through some part of North Carolina that we'd never seen before, we drove through a town called Marshall, North Carolina, and really neat town, and then made our way over to Asheville. So it all worked out. And now I still aspire to one day have that pecan pie.
Well, one of these days it can still work. Let's move on to the meat of this episode. And maybe it ties into what you've been up to, but one of the things I know we get trapped into, we covered this just a little bit with Lee Cockrell when we talked time management, but when we're getting close to the end of the year, this is the time of the year where we usually find out that we spent too much of our time over the last several months working on whatever comes up, whatever seemed urgent. And now we're not meeting our goals. We didn't accomplish everything we were hoping in the year. And we didn't work on what was important when we should have. Mike, how do you make sure that you're working on what's important and not just handling whatever comes up that seems urgent?
Yeah, and one of my favorite movies, it's about the time to watch it. It's coming out here in a little bit. I mean, we're recording this a little earlier, but the National Lampoon's Christmas Vacation, and you get into that scene where the father-in-law says to his grandkids about so do washing machines. I don't really ever want to be a washing machine. I don't want to be working hard on things that other people are dictating to me as urgent, and maybe they're really not that important. And it's hard to say no to folks. And what you've got to do is you've got to have this spectrum that you've defined, that you've identified, that is important to you. And that'll evolve over the course of a year, and over the course of a career, and over the course of a lifetime. But you've got to have that spectrum that you've created that helps you stay focused on the things that are important in life. And I've gotten back into doing this just recently, where I highlight some of the important things in the context of mind, in the context of body, in the context of family, and in the context of work. And, in order for me to keep focused, I want to make sure that I'm doing at least one thing on a daily basis that is going to impact success or impact performance for the long term in each of those categories. And it's so easy to fall off track or get off track and go through the day-to-day motions and forget about the important things related to family, or forget about the important things related to body. If you don't have a body, it's going to be hard to help meet your family's needs. And if you don't have a mind, it's going to be hard to move that body forward. And then the last one that I put out there, which is work. And work ultimately allows me to be able to support the family, or us to be able to support the family. So I think it gets back to identifying the things that are important to you, and then revisiting those on a consistent basis. And the consistent basis that I'm in right now is once a day. I want to make sure I'm doing one thing to move the ball forward in each of those 4 categories. And a lot of that comes from a book that's out there. And Jody, I think you're familiar with, I think you've read it before, The One Thing. And we'll include a link in the show notes to that book. I'm listening to it again to help me get focused again.
Yeah, The One Thing is a really important book for this topic. And also Essentialism, I think, is a really important book for this topic, because it helps you shake away what's not essential, the things you shouldn't even be doing. I actually had something, this is what's really on my mind as we talk about this. I have some really important things that I'm working on, but I had a situation recently where somebody sent me a text and asked me if I had something that it was I did have it, but it was all handwritten. And I thought, oh, well, he really wants that. So I stopped what I was doing, took the time to type it all up and send it to him, and was irritated the rest of the day, not necessarily at him, but at me for doing that, because it wasn't important. He actually would have been fine if he never would have got it. And it seemed urgent. And I stopped the important work I was doing just to work on that. Do you ever find yourself doing that, Mike? I know you really deliberate nowadays, but do you still fall into that sometimes?
Often. And it's really easy, especially in a customer first, customer oriented environment, to take those immediate requests and react to them and say, okay, well, that's something that I need to do now to help the customer. And when you fall into that trap, many times what you forget to do, you forget to ask the customer or the prospect or the friend or the whomever, when do they need it by? Now, how important is it to them right now? How urgent is it to them right now? And once you've got that data, then you can reevaluate where that fits into all of the other things that you're working on. In that instance, that person, and I don't know, well, actually, let me ask you the question. In that instance, did the person need it immediately?
They did not. And I can't comment on that because I didn't even bother to ask.
So, and I'm happy I didn't just rush to judgment and say something, because you kind of fell into the same trap that I think we all do. You perceive, because someone is asking, they wouldn't waste your time by asking you to do something that wasn't important or wasn't needed immediately. And when you make that assumption, you fall into the trap of starting to focus on others and being driven by these other requests rather than the mission that you're focused on. And what you might have found out is that person said, yep, I need it right away. I'm working on something with a project or something for a client, or I'm working on something for my family, and this is something that's going to help me right now. And then you could say, okay, it's easy enough for me to pull this together. It's going to take me a little bit of time, but I'm going to help them out and help them take care of a challenge or a need. I'm going to save them some time. But instead, we assume that this is important to them. It's also urgent. We reprioritize our day because some of the tough things that we're working on for the long term aren't going to impact us today, tomorrow, or the next day. And we fall into that trap of moving our focus on what we were working on that was going to impact the business to what this individual was asking for. We rush through it, we give it to them, and then rarely do we hear back. Like in those instances, they may not even say thanks immediately. Or if they say thanks, they don't add any additional context behind it because they don't realize the hoops that you jump through in order to execute. So put yourself in those shoes. When you've asked other people for things, how often do you tell them if something's urgent or critically important right now, or even give them a time frame and say, hey, I really appreciate this. I don't need it today. If I could just get that from you by sometime next week, that would really help me out.
Yeah, that's such an interesting thought. And because people don't value your time as much as you do, and they probably don't value your time as much as they value their time. And so not that everybody does it deliberately, but what do they care, or have they even thought that Mike's going to drop what he's doing and do this, even though what he was doing may be more important? Most people don't think like that or have it cross their mind. I just finished reading High Performance Habits. I think that's the name, by Brendon Burchard. And in that book, he says that when people ask him to do something, and these are my words on his, so I may mess this up, but he asks, when is the drop dead world's going to end if this isn't done deadline for this project? Because I've got a lot of other important things and I need to properly slot when this work will get done. And I thought, that is brilliant. I should use words like that more often.
We all could benefit from using words like that more often. And I mean, imagine the shock that somebody would have on the other side if you asked them that question. You know, some of them are probably going to be surprised that you even asked. So this topic came up in a conversation I was having with a couple of friends who are part of a learning community that I'm involved in. And we were talking about just how overwhelming this work can be, and work-life balance, and establishing goals and staying focused. And I shared the process that I was using and asked them if they thought that it would be valuable to share that with others, if they thought that it might be helpful to share it in the context of the podcast. So I thought I'd use this medium to do that. And one of the mistakes I made right out of the gate, and I'll share the visual inside the show notes on this, but one of the mistakes I made is I had too many items inside each of those categories. So I put together a Google spreadsheet. I had the list of mind, and then I had 3 things related to mind. And then I had body, and I had 4 things related to body. And then I had family, and I had 3 things related to family. And then I had work, and I had 3 things related to work. And what I found out was I was never getting to all 3 of those things on a daily basis. Now, fortunately, because I was getting to at least one on a daily basis, I felt like I was making progress, but my focus wasn't as acute as it really could have been. And what I lost sight of, because I hadn't gone back and reread the one thing again, but what I lost sight of was that whole idea of building a habit and the amount of time that it takes to build a habit and how that impacts execution. So what I've done since then is I've actually pared my list down and I've isolated it to one item for each of those 4 categories. And within mind, it's related to meditation and making that part of a daily practice. With body, it's related to activity and making 90 minutes of activity a daily practice. I have not yet been able to execute on your milestone of hitting 10,000 steps a day. And Jody, how many are you at right now? What's the streak?
I think today will be day 572, somewhere in there.
So think about that, executing on a goal 572 days in a row. And it started, I think you said 572. Was that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So 572, and it started with one day, and it started with one step, and it started with one commitment. So for me, I've got it set at 90 minutes a day of activity. And then on the family side, it's something specific related to just the general relationship that we have across our family. And related to work, it's focused on getting us to a point where we get a product out in the marketplace. So it's product development. And what I do is the reason I use a spreadsheet to put this in, or a Google Sheet to put it in, is because I can put an X or check mark every day that I accomplish my goal. And then I can look back over the course of the past week, or over the course of the past month, or over the course of the past quarter, and see how many check marks I had in there and how many days did I actually fill out every one of those objectives. And if I've gotten at the end of a week, or the end of a month, or the end of a quarter, if I have more check marks than I have blank spaces, I'm moving in the right direction. I feel like I'm executing on things.
Well, Mike, you're really focusing on this now. If this hits somebody and they say, oh my goodness, I take every phone call, I answer every email right away, I put other people's priorities way ahead of mine, and I'm not getting anywhere on things that matter to me, what advice do you have for them?
I would read Lee Cockrell's book on time management magic. I'd look at the course that you guys have put out there, because I think those are some great baseline areas to start. I'll share what I'm using as far as a methodology, but then I would also just highlight this statement. If you're allowing that to happen, you are being managed by others rather than managing yourself. And if you're allowing yourself to be managed by others, are you working toward their objectives or yours? And if you're working toward their objectives instead of yours, how are you going to accomplish the things that you want to accomplish or feel like you need to accomplish? And if you can't accomplish those things well, how are you going to continue to give back to this world, to the organization you're working with, to the people that you work with? How are you going to make that impact that only you can make?
That is a wonderful place to start, Mike. And let me say this as we wrap up. If you have a topic that you want Mike to cover on this podcast, just reach out and let us know. hello@catalystsale.com. Mike loves your questions or topics. Well, a lot of these, even if we don't outright say it, either come from a question or just a conversation Mike has had with someone, and it leads into a good podcast episode. So if you have something you would like Mike to cover, just reach out and let us know. Thank you so much, Mike, and thank you for listening to the Catalyst Sale Podcast.